Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into something kind of quirky today.
Always up for a challenge.
So we're tackling the question, are eggs vegetarian?
Interesting. I mean, it seems pretty straightforward, right?
You'd think so, but I've got a feeling things are about to get complicated. We've got two sources to guide us today. An article from Vézelay Foods, a vegan food company, and of course, good old Wikipedia, specifically the entry for eggs as food.
Okay, so we're going from a company with a definite perspective to, well, the ultimate source of general information.
Exactly. So buckle up, because this deep dive isn't just about breakfast. We're talking history, ethics, and maybe even challenging some assumptions about, well, food in general.
Sounds intriguing.
Okay, so my initial reaction, honestly, of course eggs aren't vegetarian. I mean, come on, they come from chickens.
Right, that's the obvious assumption.
But the Vézelay article points out something interesting. Commercially available eggs, the kind most of us buy, are unfertilized.
Ah, I see where this is going. So no chickens are actually harmed in the making of, say, your morning omelet.
Not directly, anyway.
Right, and that's where this concept of ovo-vegetarianism comes in. Have you heard of that?
Vaguely, but I'm not super familiar.
Basically, it's a branch of vegetarianism where people choose to eat eggs but abstain from all other animal products.
Huh. So there are vegetarians out there who do eat eggs. Never really thought about it that way.
It highlights the diversity within vegetarianism itself, all the different ways people make choices about their diets.
That's a good point. It's not just a black and white issue.
Exactly. But, and this is where things get a bit less clear-cut, the Vézelay article doesn't shy away from counter-arguments either.
Oh, so they acknowledge that there's another side to this whole egg debate.
Definitely. They dive into some of the ethical concerns surrounding the egg industry, especially, those related to factory farming.
Yeah, that's always a tough topic.
They describe the conditions in some factory farms. Overcrowded cages, beak trimming, forced molting. Pretty grim stuff.
Makes you really think about where your food is coming from. Even if no chickens are directly killed for their eggs the way they're treated, it's disturbing.
It raises a big question, Even if something is technically vegetarian, does that automatically make it ethical?
Exactly, where do you draw the line? It's a question worth pondering, for sure. Especially for those of us who, well, care about animal welfare and how our food is produced.
Right, and our understanding of food ethics is constantly evolving, too. What might have been considered acceptable decades ago is now being looked at with much more scrutiny.
Totally. Okay, before we get too deep into the philosophy of it all, can we take a little detour? I was looking at the Wikipedia entry, and wow, the world of eggs is huge-y.
Oh, yeah. Way beyond your standard chicken egg, right?
Seriously, duck eggs, goose eggs, quail eggs, even ostrich eggs. Can you imagine the size of an omelet you could make with an ostrich egg?
That's one giant breakfast. But seriously, the sheer diversity is incredible. The Wikipedia article even mentions gull eggs as a delicacy in some cultures.
Gull eggs.
Yeah. Goes to show how what's normal varies so much around the world,
Totally. Our food choices are definitely shaped by culture and where we grow up.
Absolutely. Okay, so are you ready for a quick anatomy lesson? Back to basics for a minute.
Always. I remember the basic parts of an egg from, elementary school, but I'm sure there's a lot I've forgotten.
Well, for instance, did you know the color of the eggshell is determined by the breed of chicken and its diet? But get this, the color has no impact on the nutrition. It's purely genetics and what the chicken eats.
So those fancy blue or green eggs you sometimes see at farmers markets are basically the same nutritionally as a regular brown or white egg.
Pretty much. And there's that little air cell at the larger end of the egg. It forms as the egg cools down after being laid, and the size of that air cell actually tells you how fresh the egg is. The smaller the air cell, the fresher the egg.
Oh, that's cool. So a little air pocket is actually a good thing in this case. It's like a built-in freshness indicator.
Exactly. Okay, but enough anatomy for now. I think we're all ready to get to the part we're most familiar with cooking these things.
I'm already getting hungry. And it's amazing how eggs are used in cuisines all over the world, right? Every culture seems to have its own unique way of incorporating them.
Oh, absolutely. Think about dishes like tamagoyaki in Japan, that beautifully rolled omelet, or huevos rancheros in Mexico with those fried eggs nestled on tortillas.
Yum. See, this is what I love about food. It's a window into different cultures and traditions. Oh, but we can't talk about global cuisine without mentioning century eggs, those Chinese. Well, they're definitely an experience.
Century eggs, or 100-year-old eggs as they're sometimes called, preserved duck eggs, cured in this mixture of clay, ash, salt. It's quite a process. They end up with this distinct flavor and a jelly-like texture.
Definitely an acquired taste,
Yeah.
but it speaks to the ingenuity of different cultures in preserving and transforming ingredients,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. But getting back to more familiar territory, sometimes the simplest egg preparations are the most satisfying. A perfectly cooked fried egg with that runny yolk.
Oh, stop. I'm getting hungry again.
There's something so simple yet so satisfying about that transformation in the pan. It's like culinary magic.
And those runny yolks. It's a good reminder that food safety is key when it comes to eggs, though. The Wikipedia article is pretty clear about that.
Absolutely. Washing hands, cooking to the right temperature, it's all important to avoid salmonella.
And refrigeration, too, especially here in the U.S., where eggs are washed, and that can remove a protective coating on the shell.
Right, but it's interesting that in some other countries, like in Europe, they don't wash eggs and refrigeration isn't always necessary.
Wow, so many things we take for granted.
It's amazing how much we can learn about something as seemingly simple as an egg, huh?
Seriously, it's a reminder that even everyday foods have fascinating stories. Okay, I think it's time to circle back. After all this, are eggs vegetarian?
Well, it seems the answer isn't as straightforward as we might have thought.
Definitely more nuanced than I initially assumed.
It really hinges on how you define vegetarianism itself. You know, your ethical considerations, how comfortable you are with the practices involved in egg production.
Right, and we can't forget about the whole ovo-vegetarian thing. They've clearly thought this through.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. While you're pondering that, let's add another layer of complexity. The Vézelay article touched on the environmental impact of conventional egg production. You know, all the resources used, greenhouse gas emissions, the waste generated.
Oh, right, that's a whole other aspect to consider.
Could there be a more sustainable alternative? Something that addresses both the ethical and environmental concerns.
Ooh, now that's a great question. I know there's this big movement towards plant-based alternatives for everything these days. Could vegan eggs be the answer?
It's definitely a possibility and one we'll need to explore further.
I'm really curious about this, actually. What are vegan eggs even made of? Do they actually taste like the real thing?
Well, they're usually made from things like mung beans, soy extracts, trying to mimic that eggy goodness.
So they're like engineered to act like eggs in cooking.
Pretty much. But before we get into the world of vegan eggs and whether they're a viable alternative, let's take a step back. Let's talk about the nutritional side of traditional eggs.
Okay, good point. Are they really as healthy as, well, some people claim? I remember years ago, eggs were demonized for their cholesterol content. But I've heard the science on that has changed.
You're right. The whole cholesterol conversation has gotten a lot more nuanced. The Wikipedia article breaks down egg nutrition pretty thoroughly.
All right, let's dive into the nutrition then. What does the latest science say about eggs and our health? All right, so let's talk cholesterol. I feel like for years, eggs were the poster child for foods that were bad for your heart. But I've also heard that the science on that has changed. What does the Wikipedia article say about all of this?
Yeah, it acknowledges that, eggs were demonized for their cholesterol content. There were concerns about how they might raise blood cholesterol levels, potentially increasing the risk of heart disease. But what's interesting is that more recent research has, painted a more complex picture.
Oh, really? So maybe those eggs are bad for your heart? Warnings weren't entirely accurate.
It seems that way.
That's a relief.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the current thinking on eggs and cholesterol?
Well, moderate egg consumption, like up to about 1 egg a day, doesn't seem to have a negative impact on heart health for most healthy individuals.
Okay, so 1 egg a day keeps the doctor away. Is that what we're saying?
Well, not exactly. But some studies even suggest that eggs can actually be beneficial for cardiovascular health.
Wait, beneficial? Hold on. So eggs might actually be good for your heart. How does that work?
The article points out that dietary cholesterol, the kind found in foods like eggs, doesn't directly translate to higher blood cholesterol levels. Our bodies are more complex than that.
All right, our bodies are constantly regulating things. But what about people with certain health conditions, like diabetes, or if they already have high cholesterol? Should they avoid eggs altogether?
That's where things get a little trickier. It's always best for people to consult with their doctor or, a registered dietitian for personalized advice. The article did mention some studies that suggest a possible link between high egg consumption and an increased risk of type 2 diabetes in certain populations.
So moderation is key. especially for those with pre-existing health conditions.
I think that's a wise approach. And like with any food, pay attention to how your body responds.
Makes sense. Okay, so cholesterol, check. What about the fat content of eggs? I know more than half the calories in an egg come from the yolk, which is where all the fat is. Is that something to be concerned about?
Well, yes, the yolk is where the fat is concentrated, but the good news is that a lot of that fat is unsaturated, the good fat, as they call it.
Oh, okay, so the fat in eggs isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Right. There's been a shift in how we understand dietary fat in general, right? Not all fat is created equal.
Gotcha. So to sum things up, eggs can be a healthy part of a balanced diet for most people, as long as they're consumed in moderation and, cooked properly, good source of protein, vitamins, minerals.
Exactly. And they can be enjoyed in so many ways. But we do have to remember the potential downsides, like the risk of salmonella if they aren't handled or cooked properly.
And we can't forget those ethical concerns surrounding factory farming, right? The way some laying hens are treated. Pretty unsettling.
It is. The Wikipedia article was pretty detailed about that, how the majority of eggs sold in supermarkets come from hens confined to battery cages with very little space to move around. Beak trimming, forced molting.
It's tough to hear about those practices.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if there are more humane ways to produce eggs.
Well, the article did mention alternatives, like free-range eggs, where the hens have access to outdoor spaces. And there are certifications like Certified Humane and Certified Organic that have stricter standards.
So there are options out there for consumers who want to support more ethical egg production. Good to know.
It really is empowering to know we have choices. Speaking of choices, I think it's worth exploring the cultural significance of eggs. They've played a symbolic role in various cultures for centuries.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. Eggs and new beginnings and springtime, there's definitely a connection there.
You're right. The article mentioned that in lots of cultures, eggs are seen as symbols of new life, fertility, rebirth. Makes sense, considering they contain, well, the potential for life.
That's like a little self-contained symbol of potential, right?
Yeah.
I know Easter is huge for decorating eggs, and I've even seen videos of people in Eastern European countries, I think, playing games with eggs, like egg tapping, where they try to crack each other's eggs.
It's fascinating how simple food can become so tied to cultural traditions. It's like food connects us to the past, to each other.
I love that. Food is a bridge between cultures, generations. Makes me think about those century eggs we discussed earlier. Centuries-old tradition in China. Culinary innovation and preservation all rolled into one.
It really is. A reminder that what we eat is about so much more than just fuel. It's history, culture, creativity. But speaking of creativity, the Wikipedia article touched on something I have to admit surprised me. Fake eggs.
Wait, what? Fake eggs? Like artificial? Is that even possible?
Sounds crazy, right? But it's a real thing, particularly in China. These counterfeit eggs, crafted from synthetic materials to look like real chicken eggs.
Wow, that's wild. So what are they made of, and how can you even tell them apart from real eggs?
Well, the article says they're often made from a combination of things like resin, starch, pigments molded to look like the real deal.
So they're like egg impersonator.
Pretty much. There are some telltale signs, though. An unusually smooth or shiny shell, a rubbery texture to the yolk, and the lack of that distinct air cell we talked about earlier.
Sounds like you'd really have to be paying attention to spot a fake egg. But it raises questions about, food fraud and how we can be sure what we're buying is authentic.
Exactly. Transparency and traceability in the food system are becoming increasingly important.
Totally agree. It's not just about what we're putting into our bodies, but also making informed choices that align with our values. Well, after this roller coaster ride through the world of eggs, I'm impressed. Who knew there was so much to discover?
It's been quite a journey, from anatomy and nutrition to ethics and culture.
Feeling pretty eggicated over here. But before we wrap up completely, the Wikipedia article mentioned one more aspect of egg production I think we should discuss, the darker side of the industry.
Ah, you're talking about chick culling.
Yes. I know in the egg industry, male chicks are basically considered useless because they don't lay eggs and they're not the right breed for meat production.
Right. It's a tough topic, but an important one.
What happens to them?
The most common practice is culling. They're killed shortly after hatching. It's widespread and a major ethical concern for many people.
It's hard to hear that this is still happening. Are there any alternatives?
There are some researchers and companies trying to develop methods to determine the sex of a chick before it hatches. That would eliminate the need for culling. But these technologies are still in development.
So there's still a lot of work to be done to make the industry more humane. It's a good reminder that our food choices have consequences, sometimes unintended ones.
Absolutely. Every item on our plate has a story. But there are people and organizations working towards a more ethical and sustainable food system. It's not all doom and gloom.
That's good to hear. Gives me hope. Well, after all that, I'm feeling a sense of wonder and, honestly, a bit of responsibility.
I get it. We've peeled back the layers, so to speak, and seen just how complex this seemingly simple food is.
Exactly. But before we get too overwhelmed, can we shift gears for a bit? Talk about something a little more lighthearted, like the sheer variety of ways we can enjoy eggs.
Ah, yes. From humble scrambled eggs to elegant soufflés, the possibilities are endless.
Okay, culinary journey time. The Wikipedia article does a good job of highlighting how important eggs are in cooking. Binding ingredients, creating texture,
They're like culinary chameleons. Think about a creamy custard or a perfectly risen soufflé, all thanks to the magic of eggs.
and the variety of egg dishes out there is just incredible. Omelets, frittatas, quiches, stratas, so many choices.
Every culture has its own unique traditions. In Japan, you've got tamagoyaki, that rolled omelet.
Uh-huh.
In Mexico, huevos rancheros.
Oh, and we can't forget about breakfast. Sunny side up, scrambled over easy. Breakfast eggs are a classic for a reason.
They really are the perfect way to start the day.
But why limit ourselves to breakfast? Eggs are fantastic in lunch and dinner dishes too. Cobb salad with a hard-boiled egg, ramen with a soft-boiled egg on top.
Oh, yes. And let's not forget baking, cookies, cakes, breads, pastries. Eggs are essential.
And did you know the protein in cooked eggs is almost twice as absorbable as the protein from raw eggs? Cooking them doesn't just make them safer, it makes them more nutritious.
It really does. The way we prepare food has a huge impact on both its taste and nutritional value.
But sometimes, simple is best. A perfectly fried egg, crispy edges, runny yolk, just perfect.
That sizzle in the pan, culinary magic.
It really is. And so quick to make too. Speaking of cooking, we should touch on egg safety again. The Wikipedia article emphasized how important it is to handle and store eggs properly to avoid salmonella.
Absolutely crucial. Washing your hands, cooking them thoroughly. All essential to prevent foodborne illness.
And refrigeration, especially in the US where those commercially produced eggs are washed.
Right, that washing can remove a protective layer on the shell, so refrigeration becomes even more important.
It's interesting how food safety practices can be so different around the world. We mentioned how in Europe, for example, they don't typically wash eggs, and refrigeration isn't always necessary.
It really highlights how diverse our approaches to food can be. And speaking of diversity, we can't forget about those fascinating preservation methods like century eggs or pickled eggs.
Those are definitely unique culinary traditions, pushing the boundaries of what you can do with an egg.
It goes to show, how resourceful people have been throughout history, finding ways to make the most of their food and preserve it for longer periods.
Well, after all of that, from history and ethics to science and cuisine, I'm feeling a newfound appreciation for eggs.
Me too. They're packed with nutrition, incredibly versatile, and steeped in cultural traditions.
And with the rise of plant-based alternatives, maybe even insect-based eggs on the horizon, the future of eggs is looking pretty interesting. It feels like we've just scratched the surface, honestly. There's so much more to think about, especially when it comes to the future of eggs. What choices are we making as consumers?
I agree. And this is where things get really, exciting, I think. We've talked about the ethical challenges, the environmental impact, the rise of plant-based alternatives, even the potential for insect-based eggs. What does the future hold for this multifaceted food?
It's almost like we're at a crossroads. Will we see a shift towards more sustainable practices in conventional production? Will plant-based or even insect-based eggs become the norm? Or will people stick with the traditional chicken egg despite all the, complexities we've uncovered?
Big questions, and I don't think there's a single answer. It probably depends on so many things. Technology, what consumers demand, maybe even shifts in culture.
We talked about how food and culture are intertwined, right?
Yeah.
So as we face these new challenges, these new possibilities in food production, will our traditions evolve too?
It's fascinating to think about how will people view eggs, 50 years from now, especially as these new alternatives become more available, more accepted.
Speaking of alternatives, we were starting to talk about vegan eggs before we got sidetracked by all those delicious ways to cook regular eggs. What can you tell us about these plant-based wonders?
Well, vegan eggs have come a long way. They're getting pretty good at replicating the taste and texture of chicken eggs. Like we said before, they're usually made from things like mung beans, soy protein, other plant-based starches and gums.
So they're designed to, act like eggs in recipes. Do they actually work?
It really depends on the product and the recipe. Some are better for certain things than others. Some are great for scrambles and omelets. Others are better for baking, binding ingredients together.
Sounds like there's a bit of a learning curve. Any tips for someone who wants to give vegan eggs a try?
Don't be afraid to experiment. There are tons of different brands and types out there. Try a few, see what works for you.
Good advice. And I think it speaks to a larger point. The future of food is about innovation, trying new things, plant-based alternatives, more humane and sustainable farming, even exploring things like insect protein. It's exciting.
It is. The food landscape is constantly changing. A great time to be a curious eater, I think.
Couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of eggs, I think it's safe to say we've all learned a lot.
We have, from nutrition and cooking to ethics and culture, we've covered a lot of ground.
Definitely feeling more educated. And I think it's a journey we can all continue on our own, thinking about the choices we make, the food we eat, and how it impacts the world around us.
Well said. Whether you're a lifelong egg lover or new to the world of plant-based alternatives, stay curious, keep exploring. There's always something new to discover.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the future of eggs. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.